The last car pulled out of the driveway at 11:13. I know because I heard the gravel, that particular sound, like something settling, and I remember thinking that it was over, that everyone had gone, and that I could stop holding my face a certain way now. The water at the sink was too hot. It had been too hot for a while. I hadn't adjusted it. Behind me, Conrad was loosening his tie. I could hear the sound of the scotch bottle, the specific weight of it being set down on the marble, and the pendant light above the island was doing the thing it does, that barely there flicker, the one that had been going on for 7 months. I had stopped mentioning it. The kitchen smelled like the candles from the dining room. Beeswax. Slightly sweet. Someone had laughed so hard at dinner the flame had nearly gone out, and the smoke had drifted in and settled, and I was thinking about that. About nothing, really, when he said it. Not in anger. That is the part one have turned over and over. There was no argument. No tension that I had noticed. It had been, by every visible measure, a nice evening. He said it the way you'd mention the weather on the way in from the car.
Calm.
Almost offhand. You'd be nothing without me, you know that. The glass touched the counter. The pendant flickered. The steam from the sink rose up and blurred the corners of the window. I set down the wine glass I was holding. I didn't turn around. I didn't say anything. My fingertips had gone pink from the water. I noticed that. I noticed the way the window had fogged at the edges, a soft white border forming in the cold. I noticed these things because when you cannot speak, you look at whatever is in front of you. I didn't say anything that night, but I had already made a decision. And it was the first decision in 14 years that I made entirely alone and entirely without fear. I didn't grow up thinking of myself as someone who wanted things. That's not self-pity, just the particular logic of being raised by careful people in a careful house. My parents paid bills on a Tuesday. They returned shopping carts. They used the word practical as a compliment, which is why it took me until my mid-20s to understand I also wanted something else. I worked at a diner called Paulette's through most of university. Thursday to Sunday, breakfast and lunch shifts, a place that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and the industrial cleaner they used on the floor tiles every morning before opening. I was a fast waitress. I remembered orders without writing them down, which the regulars liked. I have no nostalgia for Paulette's. I ate there twice in 4 years, and that tells you everything. I finished my degree on partial scholarship, moved into a desk in a shared studio in downtown Greensboro, and spent the first year of my career cold emailing small businesses and showing up at networking events in clothes I'd had since graduation. I designed my own logo at 2 a.m. using a free trial of software I couldn't afford to buy. I had 4 clients by 28. Not large ones, but mine. I met Conrad at 29 at an event I attended only because my colleague Deanna told me I worked too much. He was the kind of man who made a room feel more organized just by being in it. Not aggressive, sure of himself in a way that didn't need announcing. He told a story that night about getting lost in Portugal and made everyone within earshot laugh. And when he turned to bring me into the circle, the attention felt specific. Like he'd been meaning to include me. We married 18 months later. His firm moved us to Raleigh. I scaled my studio back. New city, new start, and it seemed at the time like the practical thing. Nell arrived when I was 32 and rearranged everything the way children do. Completely and temporarily. Nell is 12 now. She has Conrad's jaw and my stubbornness, which I have always considered an uneven inheritance and have never said to her face. Conrad is not easy to describe to someone who has only heard his name in a story like this. At a dinner party, he is the reason people stay later than they planned. He remembers the details, your mother's name, the thing you mentioned 3 months ago about your roof, your kid's school play. He picks up checks without announcement. When a colleague's father was ill, Conrad drove 40 minutes to visit a man he had met twice. He is genuinely good at the version of himself that other people see. Inside the house, he is exacting. That is the only word that fits. He keeps a ledger, not a physical one, not written anywhere, but a running account of what has been given and what is owed, and whether things have been handled to the standard they should have been. He does not discuss this ledger. It simply shapes every exchange, every pause, every thank you that arrives slightly later than it should. Last spring, I organized the silent auction for Nell's school fundraiser. 23 items, all sourced by me. The printed materials, me. 2 evenings at the kitchen table after Nell was in bed. I built the bid tracking spreadsheet from a template I modified myself. The auction raised $14,300. 3 different parents came to find Conrad that evening to tell him what an incredible job his wife had done. He thanked them graciously. On the drive home, he said, "It went okay." I looked out the passenger window and said, "Yeah, it went okay." There is a small watercolor in the hallway between our front door and the kitchen, painted the summer I graduated, a coastal scene with gray water, gray sky, and one narrow strip of yellow at the horizon. It is not technically accomplished. I have always known this, but I love it in the way you love something you made before you knew enough to be self-conscious about it. When Conrad shows guests through the house, he gestures at it warmly. "Thea did that when she was young," he says with a fond laugh, "before she really knew what she was doing." The guests smile. I smile. I have smiled at that sentence for 11 years. 2 years before the dinner party, I started rebuilding. That's not quite the right word. I hadn't been destroyed. Not yet, but it's the one that fits. I reached out to 2 former clients whose contact details I still had, took on a small refresh project for a Pilates studio, and then, in March, I landed a commercial contract I hadn't let myself hope for. A boutique dental practice on the north side of Raleigh, full interior redesign, $47,000. The largest single contract I had ever signed with my own name. I told Conrad at dinner. He listened. He nodded. He said, "That's great. Just don't overextend yourself." He said it gently. That's what I want to be precise about. There was no edge to it. He touched my hand briefly before reaching for his glass. It sounded like concern, and I received it as concern, and that was that. Around the same time, I had quoted on a second project, a small chain of physiotherapy clinics, a friend of Conrad's from his golf league, a man named Russ who wore the same brand of fleece in 3 different colors and who had seemed genuinely interested when I showed him my preliminary ideas. I followed up once, politely. He didn't respond. I assumed he'd gone another direction, and I let it go. 6 months later, at a birthday lunch for a woman we both knew, Russ mentioned it. Casually. The way you mentioned something that was resolved so long ago, it's barely worth noting. "Oh, Conrad told me you weren't really taking on big projects right now, that you were pulling back." I figured it wasn't a good time. I heard myself say something appropriate. I smiled. I picked up my water glass. Conrad had called Russ, had told him this, had not said a word to me. That evening I went home and made Nell's lunch for the next day, the crusts off the sandwich, the apple cut into 8s, and put a load of laundry on, and waited until Nell was in bed before I said anything. I kept my voice even. I told him what Russ had said. He was immediately completely calm. He had been worried about me. I'd seemed stressed in the weeks before, and he knew how I got when I took on too much, and he'd just mentioned to Russ in passing that the timing wasn't ideal. He hadn't thought it would come back around. He should have told me. He was sorry. He said all of this looking directly at me, and it was so coherent, so apparently reasonable, that I spent 3 days afterward reviewing my own memory. Had I seemed stressed? Was I being unfair? Was I taking something that had been done for me and making it into something that had been done to me? I went back to the dental practice project. I didn't mention Russ again. But that week I opened an email twice. Contacts I'd been meaning to reach out to about potential work, and both times I closed the window before I typed a word. I told myself I was being thoughtful about timing. That is how it works. That is the part that took me years to understand. Nothing is taken all at once. You adjust. You put on another layer. You stop noticing the temperature of the room because you have slowly, completely forgotten what warm felt like. The worst part wasn't what he'd done. The worst part was that I thanked him for caring. I actually thanked him. And he accepted it. The dental practice project was done by October. Dr. Anand sent a handwritten note. A regional design newsletter ran a small photograph of the reception area. Warm oak, low pendants, and matte plaster walls I'd specified down to the finished grade. I printed it, put it in a folder. When I showed Conrad, he said it looked great and asked what was for dinner. I had already started reaching out to new clients. One came back quickly, a small restaurant group, early conversations, nothing signed. The other was a referral from Dr. Anand, an architecture firm that needed someone to manage interiors on a residential build in North Hills. $63,000, phased over 8 months. I scheduled the meeting and prepared for it the way I used to prepare for everything, methodically, with a folder that had tabs. Around that time, my mother began calling with a particular kind of gentleness. "How are you really doing, sweetheart?" The way she'd spoken when my grandfather was ill, and no one wanted to say the word. I didn't understand it until I overheard Conrad on the phone one afternoon, coming in from the garage. "Fragments only. She's taken on too much, I think. She seems like she's struggling to manage." His voice was low, considered. The voice of someone carrying a concern they've been holding privately. I asked him that evening. He was genuinely bewildered, head tilted, eyebrows up, the expression of a man being accused of something he finds obviously untrue. He'd just been worried. He'd mentioned it to a few people. He hadn't realized that was a problem. I ended up apologizing for how I'd raised it. I am still thinking about that. A few weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Nell and I were eating toast at the kitchen counter. She was doing the thing she does, picking the sesame seeds off her bread and lining them up along the edge of her plate, one by one, which I have never commented on because some habits belong only to the person who has them. She looked up and said, without any particular weight, "How come you don't do your art anymore?" I told her I'd just been busy. She nodded and went back to her seeds. My coffee went cold. 3 years. I hadn't drawn anything, painted anything, not a sketch, not a margin doodle, in more than 3 years, and I could not find the moment I had stopped. That was the part that didn't leave me. Not the stopping, the not having noticed. In November, Conrad's firm hosted a dinner for a private equity group from Charlotte. 8 people in a private room, heavy linen napkins, and a wine list in a leather folder. I had been to these evenings before. I knew what was expected. When conversation turned to what spouses did, Conrad smiled at me warmly and said, "Thea dabbles in interior design. Does the occasional project." I picked up my water glass. I thought very specifically about whether the word dabbles had ever appeared in a contract, an invoice, a letter from my accountant. It hadn't. I had 2 active commercial contracts totaling more than $100,000. I smiled, said something modest, let it move on. In the car home, I looked at the highway for 23 minutes. Conrad talked about one of the Charlotte men who'd been good company. I said at the right moments. He didn't notice. 2 weeks later, he suggested a long weekend. A rental at the Outer Banks, just the 2 of us, Nell at his mother's. He was warm. He bought the wine I like. On the second night, he said, "I know I don't always show up the way I should. I want to do better." Something loosened in my chest. I started wondering if I'd been holding on too tightly to things that hadn't been meant the way I'd taken them. We came home. 2 days later, a package arrived. A registration confirmation for a weekend seminar, turning your passion into a side hustle, a workshop for hobbyists and small business beginners. He'd signed me up while we were away. He mentioned it at dinner, cheerfully, thought it might be useful, supposed to be really practical. I looked at the paper. I looked at him. His expression was genuinely pleased. I said, "Thank you." That same week, I was unloading my car after a site visit. Sample books, a rolled tube of drawings, a bag of fabric swatches, when Philippa from 3 houses down looked up from her garden. She taught secondary school English for 31 years before retiring last spring, and she has the particular quality of stillness that comes from decades of watching people who think no one is watching them. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You look tired, love. Not the regular kind." I told her I was fine. She nodded once. She said, "I know," and went back to her roses. I've thought about this a lot. Has anyone ever been told they're too sensitive so many times that they started to believe it? Because I had stopped trusting my own eyes. I thought the problem was my perception. I spent 2 years trying to correct it, monitoring myself, second-guessing myself, adjusting. It never once occurred to me to look at what was causing it. There were 8 of them at the table that night. Good wine, good food. Conrad had spent 40 minutes on the playlist alone. By 9, he had the whole table laughing at a story about a conference in Atlanta, and I watched everyone lean forward the way people do when they don't want to miss anything. Someone asked about my project. The architecture firm, the North Hills Build. I'd mentioned it at a previous dinner, and she'd remembered, which I noticed. I started to answer. Conrad came in gently and smoothly with a story about a deal his firm had just closed. Not aggressive, not even conscious, I think. The conversation moved. I picked up my fork. Later, as people were getting their coats, someone said how warm the house felt, the way everything sat together, the lighting, the proportions. Conrad touched my shoulder briefly. "Thea has an eye for it," he said. "She's done well with the space." The guest smiled. I smiled. He went to bed around midnight. I finished the dishes. Something didn't break that night. Breaking would have been cleaner. What happened was quieter, more like a sound that had been running underneath, everything finally going still. A frequency I hadn't known I was hearing until it stopped. Over the 3 weeks that followed, I stopped explaining myself. Not dramatically. I didn't announce it. I just stopped. Stopped offering context for my choices. Stopped defending my schedule. Stopped arriving at difficult conversations with my evidence already assembled. Not because I had given up on the marriage. Because I finally understood, in a way that settled rather than shook me, that the conversation I kept trying to have was one he had never meant to join. For 14 years, I had set the coffee maker before bed. Every night. 6:45, automatic brew, so it was ready when Conrad came downstairs before I was properly awake. It had long stopped being a decision. One evening I washed my face, brushed my teeth, and went to bed. I hadn't planned it. He noticed 3 days later. Asked, with a particular irritable edge, why the coffee wasn't ready. I said the machine might need cleaning. He didn't follow up. I never said it again. The next 6 weeks were the quietest I'd lived in that house. Not peaceful. Quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone has stopped expecting anything from it. I used to think holding yourself together for everyone else was strength. I understand now that it was just a very long way of disappearing. And that the day I stopped bracing for impact was the very day I started to figure out what I actually wanted. It happened on a Tuesday. The contractor who'd looked at the foundation crack had asked me to check our homeowner's coverage, and I went into Conrad's office to find the insurance folder. He keeps household documents in the bottom drawer of his desk, I knew that much. I opened the wrong drawer first, found nothing, and tried the next one down. The insurance folder was there. Behind it was a manila folder I had never seen. Conrad's handwriting on the tab. 2 letters and a word. FCT account. I don't know why I opened it. I think I already knew, in the way your body sometimes arrives at a conclusion before your mind is willing to. 26 months of bank statements. An account at a bank we didn't use, in Conrad's name only. I looked at the deposit column. Transfers from our joint account. The amounts varied, irregular in a way that felt considered. $1,200 in March, $950 in April, $1,400 in June, then nothing for 2 months, then $800 in September. I ran the columns in my head the way I used to run bid calculations. I arrived at a number, approximately $43,600, over 26 months. I photographed every page. My hands were steady. I noticed this, the steadiness, and understood it as something. I wasn't sure what yet. I put the folder back. 4th from the front, left side. I noted the position carefully, the slight angle of it, so I would know if it moved. Behind the bank folder, paper clipped to the inside of the back cover, was a printed email. Conrad's address at the top. His brother Derek in Knoxville, a man I have always found slightly difficult to read, pleasant in a surface way that never quite extended downward. The email was dated 11 months ago. Most of it was about a fishing trip, dates, and logistics, whether Derek should drive or fly. In the third paragraph, in the same even tone as the fishing trip, she'll never actually leave. She doesn't have the infrastructure for it. I've made sure of that. I read it twice. I did not read it a third time. I photographed it. I stood in the office for what felt like a short while. Then I went to the kitchen and started making dinner. He came home at 6:15. I had made pasta, the one with the sausage from the Italian market on Hillsborough Street, the brand he prefers. Nell was at the table telling a story about two girls in her friend group, something that had happened at lunch, a disagreement that had already resolved itself, but which Nell was reconstructing in full for the record. Conrad asked the right questions. He is good at that. I passed the bread. I asked about his day. He said it had been long, a meeting that ran over the usual. I said I heard. He told a story about someone in his office who'd mispronounced a word in front of the whole team, and I laughed in the right place. The pasta was good. Nell had seconds. Conrad poured himself a glass of wine and offered me one, and I said yes, and he poured it. And we sat there in the kitchen of the house he decided I would never have the infrastructure to leave, and I smiled, and I was already somewhere else entirely. I sat with that information for 4 days. 4 days of knowing and saying nothing. I've thought about it since, whether I should have acted immediately, whether staying quiet was wisdom or just the final reflex of a habit I'd been practicing for years. I've turned it over, and I still don't know. What would you have done? I mean that genuinely. I've spoken to women since who said they would have confronted him that night. Others who said they would have been in the car before he got home. I understand both of those completely. I don't think either of them was wrong. All I know is what I did. I said nothing. I made dinner, and I started making plans. I had met Bea on a commercial renovation project 18 months earlier. She was the project manager on the contractor side, efficient and direct, the kind of person who sends 1 email instead of 3. We'd worked well together for 6 weeks and stayed loosely in touch. At some point, in some conversation I had barely tracked at the time, she had mentioned a family law attorney. I had filed it away the way you file away information that doesn't apply to you. On the 5th morning, I found the note. Renata Chow's office was on Glenwood Avenue, 13 minutes from my house. I made the appointment myself from my phone, sitting in my car outside a fabric supplier during my lunch break. $2.75 for the first hour. I paid cash. She was 51, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a desk with actual stacks of paper on it rather than the performative tidiness of someone trying to seem competent. She let me talk for 20 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is going to be fine. I've seen worse, and I've seen people walk out of much worse just fine. Let's start." I hadn't known how much I needed someone to say that until she said it. Over the following week, I worked methodically. 26 months of financial records, photographed, scanned, labeled by date and account. My own business records, every invoice and contract going back for years. The bank statements from the FCT account. The email. I created a cloud storage account using an address I had never used for anything, logged into it only for my phone, and uploaded everything. Physical copies went into a folder in the trunk of my car, inside a canvas tote from a design trade show I'd attended 2 years ago, underneath 3 fabric sample books. I thought about what Renata had said. Infrastructure. I was building some. I opened a bank account in my name only, the first since the year before we married. A branch on Wake Forest Road, a Tuesday afternoon. The teller was 22 years old and asked, while the account was being set up, if I'd like to add a joint account holder. I said no. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a few minutes. I wasn't sure exactly what I was feeling. It wasn't grief, wasn't relief, and wasn't anything with a clean name. Whatever it was, it moved through me and was done, and then I went inside. I hadn't told Nell anything. Renata had been clear about this. Nothing said that could be repeated, and Nell was 12, which meant she was old enough to repeat things in ways she didn't intend. But I wanted to know before I filed anything, before anything shifted officially, that she had some capacity for change. Children do. I just needed to see it. One evening I made hot chocolate from scratch. Cocoa powder, warm milk, and a small amount of sugar. I hadn't made it in years. We sat at the kitchen table, and Nell wrapped both hands around her mug the way she's done since she was small. I said, "If things changed around here, at home, would you be okay?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, things already changed. I just didn't know if you'd noticed." I stirred my cocoa for a long time. She had become someone she almost forgot she was. And she was just getting started. I dropped Nell at her friend's house at 4 o'clock. I stayed long enough to say hello to the other mother, who offered me tea with genuine warmth and seemed disappointed when I said I couldn't stay. I told her another time. I drove home the long way without deciding to. Conrad was in the living room. Formula One documentary, the kind he watches 3 or 4 times a month, tire analysis and lap times, the particular ambient sound of Sunday evenings. I poured a glass of water in the kitchen, stood at the sink for a moment looking at the window. Then I went in and sat down in the armchair across from him. I didn't turn the television off. I didn't say anything. I just sat. He watched the screen for a few more seconds. Then something, the quality of the silence, maybe, or the quality of my stillness, made him reach for the remote. He muted it. He looked at me. He said, "What?" I told him about the account. The one opened 26 months ago at a bank we didn't use. In his name only. I told him the approximate total, $43,600, was transferred out of our joint account in amounts small enough not to invite a conversation. And I told him in one sentence about the email to Derek. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean toward him. I stated it the way you'd read from a list, one item at a time, and when I finished, I stopped talking. The first thing he said was, "Where did you get that? Have you been going through my office?" I waited. That account was for our future. I was protecting us. I was setting something aside because you have no idea what the market does in 5 years, and someone in this house has to plan for that. I waited. You've been paranoid for months, Thea. I've been worried about you. That's why I've been talking to your mother, not to manage you, because I was genuinely concerned, and I didn't know what else to do. You haven't been yourself. I watched his face move through each of these. I recognized the architecture, the way each version built on the last, the way his concern for me arrived precisely when the other explanations ran dry. I had spent years inside that architecture. I knew every room. When none of it landed, when my expression stayed still, and I didn't fill the silences he was leaving for me to fill, something shifted in him. His shoulders dropped slightly. He leaned forward and reached across the coffee table, reached for my hand. His voice went quieter. "Thea, let's talk about this properly. We can fix this." I looked at his hand, the familiar shape of it, the ring he still wore. I didn't take it. I said, "My attorney will be in contact tomorrow morning." I stood up and walked into the hallway. The watercolor was where it had always been, the small framed painting between the front door and the kitchen, the one I had made the summer after graduation. Gray water, gray sky, and one narrow strip of yellow at the horizon, put in almost as an afterthought, the kind of decision you make at 22 before you've learned to doubt yourself. Conrad had gestured at it warmly for 11 years, before she really knew what she was doing. I looked at it. I lifted it off the wall. It was lighter than I remembered. I carried it upstairs. He didn't ask. I didn't explain. From my desk, I could hear the documentary resume, the volume coming back up, and commentary over the sound of engines somewhere on a circuit I didn't know. I sat with the watercolor leaning against the wall beside me and understood, without any particular feeling, that I had stopped trying to know what he was feeling in the room below. It wasn't coldness. It was the end of a habit I had practiced for so long I had mistaken it for instinct. I texted Renata. "Ready." She replied 11 minutes later. first thing tomorrow. Get some sleep. I didn't sleep well, but the sleeplessness felt different, restless rather than heavy, like the hours before something begins rather than the long, exhausted dark of something being endured. I used to imagine how it would feel, saying the truth out loud after 14 years of editing it. I thought it would feel like winning. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like finally being able to breathe without someone standing on my chest. I didn't need him to say I was right. I didn't need anything from him at all. That, I think, was the actual moment it was over. 3 couples from our regular circle went quiet in the weeks that followed. No confrontation, no declared allegiances. They simply became unavailable. The group chat, which had once produced a steady low hum of restaurant recommendations and photographs from someone's weekend away, went still. I watched the silence arrive and understood it without bitterness. Conrad is easier to be around. He is funnier. He fills a room faster and leaves less complicated residue. I have never blamed people for choosing the simpler version of a situation. I've done it myself. What I didn't expect was Deirdre. We had always liked each other in a neighboring frequency kind of way, present at the same dinners, genuinely glad to see each other. Never quite close. 3 weeks after Renata filed, Deirdre sent a text. "I've been thinking about you. Can we get coffee?" 6 words with no agenda visible in them. And then Priya, who I had always understood to be Conrad's friend more than mine, appeared at my door one Saturday afternoon with a bottle of white wine and stayed for 40 minutes. On her way out, she said, "I just wanted you to know I'm not confused about what happened." I saved both texts. I'm not sure I've known what to do with them yet, but I've kept them. The legal process took 9 months. Renata called the FCD account and the email a gift, by which she meant they were professionally useful to her, which is a different thing from saying any of it was easy. Discovery revealed a financial picture more organized than I had known. Conrad had been deliberate in ways that required a forensic accountant and a considerable number of hours I paid for by the quarter. It was expensive and slow and involved at one point, sitting in a beige conference room for 4 hours reviewing documents I did not understand while a man across the table pretended I wasn't there. I understood why people settled early. I didn't. The outcome was structured in my favor in ways that would not have been possible without the folder I'd found on a Tuesday afternoon in a drawer I'd opened by accident. I have thought about that, the randomness of it, the contractor and the foundation crack, and the wrong drawer first. I try not to think about it too much. Nell, and I moved into a rental on the other side of Raleigh in early spring. Smaller than what we'd had. A neighborhood I didn't know at all, which turned out to be easier. No one's expression to read. No context to manage. The kitchen had 3 east-facing windows, and in the mornings the light came in low and flat across the counter in a way I hadn't prepared for, and I found it briefly consoling every day without ever quite getting used to it. Nell's room had a slanted ceiling. She said it was actually kind of cool, which I chose to believe. It was not a smooth transition. There were 3 months when Nell was quieter than herself, not withdrawn, not angry, just muted in some register I couldn't fully reach. I gave her more space and more presence at the same time, which was exhausting to calibrate and not always correctly done. She came back. Children do, mostly, if you stay close enough and still enough. I re-registered my business. New name, same work. 2 clients in the first 3 months. A young couple renovating their first home in a neighborhood south of downtown, and a small nonprofit that couldn't pay much. I took the nonprofit because I wanted to, which was a reason I hadn't used in years without first clearing it with some internal committee I'd never agreed to form. Philippa appeared one Saturday morning carrying a peace lily in a terracotta pot with a crack repaired along one side using a line of gold adhesive. She said, without any introduction, "I don't know if you have room, but it seemed like it needed somewhere better to be." I put it on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light falls. It has not died. 6 months in, the 3 of us ate Thai takeout on the living room floor because I still hadn't bought a kitchen table. I've been thinking about one. I want to choose it carefully. Philippa said something. I won't tell you what exactly. And Nell laughed so hard she had to put her spring roll down. She grabbed her drink just before it went over. Her face was completely unguarded, not performing happiness, not managing anything, just laughing. I didn't say a word. I just watched her. Something I had been carrying for a long time, without ever finding a name for it, quietly put itself down. The settlement reflected the full financial picture. He paid, not quickly, not without the particular friction of a man who has always believed that friction is a negotiating tool, but completely, and in the end on terms that Renata described as correct. I have learned to find satisfaction in the word correct. It is quieter than the alternatives, and it lasts longer. He moved into a condo in a newer development north of the city. By all accounts, he is fine. Still charming. Still the kind of man who picks up the check before anyone else reaches for their wallet. I believe this entirely. It was never the whole picture of him, but it was always a true part, and I have stopped needing those things to be contradictions. Deirdre told me about the remarriage carefully, watching my face as she said it. Someone from his firm, younger, a woman I've never met. I think Deirdre expected it to land a certain way. It didn't. What I felt was closer to a lock turning somewhere in a room I had already stopped entering. A door closing that had been standing open for no reason. That was all. The watercolor is in the kitchen now. It moved with me through 2 interim decisions about where things should live and arrived, eventually on the wall beside the east-facing windows. Not the hallway. The kitchen, where I make my coffee in the morning, where the light comes through low and unhurried and falls across the painted water in a way it never did before. It is not a great painting. I have always known this. But in the morning with no one offering commentary, it looks like exactly what it is, something I made myself, honestly, when I was young enough to do it without apology. 3 weeks after I reopened the business, a voicemail arrived from someone I had never spoken to. A referral. She said she'd heard I was the person to call, that someone had told her I understood what a space should feel like. I listened to it 3 times. Then I saved it. He was right about one thing. I would be nothing without him. Nothing like this. Nothing this clear, this quiet, this entirely my own. The most dangerous thing a controlling person can do is not shout. It isn't threatening or making scenes or any of the things that are easy to point at and name. The most dangerous thing they can do is quieter than that. It is the gradual, patient work of convincing you that the edges of your world are the edges of your capability, that you are exactly as small as they need you to be, and that this smallness is simply who you are. Thea spent 11 years believing she had reached the limit of what she was able to do. She scaled back her ambitions and called it practicality. She stopped painting and called it growing up. She explained herself and justified herself and made herself smaller, incrementally, because every time she grew, there was a hand on her shoulder framing it as concern. She was not broken. She was managed. There is a difference. And the difference is worth knowing. Not everyone watching this is in a marriage. Not every version of this story has a husband in it. Some of them have a parent, a sibling, a friend you have known so long you can no longer remember who you were before them. The specific name doesn't matter. The mechanism is the same. The question is not what he said to her in that kitchen. The question is when she decided to believe something else instead. And that, not the leaving, not the lawyer, not the settlement, is the part that changed her life.